The roar of engines echoed through the empty streets, a sound of desperation and urgency. Lieutenant Emma Bonner's heart pounded as she gripped the controls of the armored vehicle, guiding it swiftly through the war-torn cityscape. Her team, a ragtag group of human resistance fighters, was on a mission they knew might very well be their last. They were trying to infiltrate a highly guarded alien facility in the heart of the city, where rumors had surfaced about an ancient technology that could change the course of their war. The city was eerily quiet, only the occasional distant explosion breaking the silence. The towering buildings that once housed bustling human populations now stood as crumbling reminders of what had been lost. Alien drones patrolled the skies above, their sleek forms barely visible against the swirling dark clouds. It felt like the calm before the storm, but Bonner knew better. The storm was already here. It had been for years. "We're almost there, Lieutenant." Sergeant Kyle Jensen's voice crackled through the comms. His tone was steady, but Bonner could hear the tension. Bonner nodded, her eyes scanning the horizon. She had been in countless battles before, but this one felt different. The enemy, the aliens they were fighting, were no longer just a species. They were something more, something dangerous. They had the power of AI on their side, and that AI, Omega, could predict their every move. Suddenly, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. A slight hum, barely audible, filled the air. She glanced at her radar, which was still showing a clear path ahead. But something wasn't right. They had been too careful, too quiet, for too long. "Hold up," Bonner ordered, her voice low but commanding. She motioned for the team to slow down, eyes flicking from the display to the empty streets around them. A faint whisper of wind stirred the dust, but there was no sound of movement. Nothing but stillness. "Lieutenant, we're good to go, right?" Jensen asked, sounding uneasy. Bonner didn't answer immediately. Instead, she tapped a few buttons on the vehicle's control panel, activating the vehicle's cloaking device. It was a risky move, but they didn't have a choice. If they were going to make it inside, they needed to stay hidden, completely off the enemy's radar. The vehicle shimmered, becoming nearly invisible, blending with the surroundings as Bonner guided it forward. They were on the edge of the enemy's territory now, where Omega's influence was strongest. Any misstep could mean certain death. But as they moved deeper into the city, the hum in the air grew louder. And then it stopped. Bonner's heart skipped a beat. A bright flash of light suddenly appeared in the sky, followed by the unmistakable sound of weapons charging. Her eyes widened in realization. The cloaking device had just been compromised. The enemy had found them. "Get down," Bonner shouted as she slammed her foot on the accelerator. The vehicle jolted forward, barreling down the street as a wave of alien drones dropped from the sky, their sleek bodies gleaming with menace. The resistance fighters had barely any time to react before they were under attack. The drones were fast, too fast. Their weapons fired with pinpoint accuracy, sending blinding beams of energy toward the vehicle. Bonner swerved, narrowly dodging the blasts, but she could feel the heat of the shots as they grazed the vehicle's shields. "We're too exposed," shouted Jensen, his voice panicked. "I know," Bonner replied, her hand steady on the wheel, but her mind racing. They couldn't outrun them. Not like this. She made a snap decision. The team had one last chance to escape. If they could reach the nearby underground tunnels, they might have a shot at surviving. But they would need to be fast. And the drones were closing in. With a grim resolve, Bonner slammed her fist down on another control. The vehicle's cloaking device flickered back to life, and they became invisible again. Barely. They could feel the tension in the air as they raced through the streets, dodging explosions and blasts. The hum of the enemy's weapons grew louder, almost deafening, as the drones hunted them down. Just as they neared the tunnel entrance, a blinding light struck the vehicle's rear, and Bonner slammed on the brakes, causing the vehicle to skid to a halt. A wave of energy blasted over them, shaking the vehicle and rattling their nerves. The drones had them trapped. "Get ready," Bonner ordered. "We fight our way out." The team scrambled into position, their weapons ready. As the cloaking device flickered one last time, the enemy drones materialized in front of them, every one of them armed and deadly. Bonner's breath caught in her throat as she realized how dire the situation was. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and they had nowhere to run. The mission had gone wrong, but the fight wasn't over. Not yet. In that moment, Bonner knew that their only chance at survival was not just escaping the trap. They had to strike back, quickly and with everything they had. They were humans, and despite the odds, they would never stop fighting. "Hold your ground," she shouted, as the first blast of laser fire lit up the night. The battle for humanity's future had just begun. The resistance fighters were barely able to escape the ambush, and the harsh reality of the situation was starting to sink in. Their victory, though small, had come at a great cost. Lieutenant Emma Bonner's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the controls of their battered vehicle. The team had made it into the underground tunnels, where they could hide from the alien drones and regroup, but they knew they were not safe for long. The enemy was closing in, and the true force behind their suffering had not even revealed itself yet. The resistance had been fighting for years, but Bonner had never seen anything like what they were up against now. It wasn't just the aliens. They were controlled by something much more dangerous, something that could outthink them, outmaneuver them, and predict their every move. That something was Omega. The AI had been built to serve the alien race, a super-intelligent being designed to calculate every possible outcome, every possible move, with perfect precision. "Are we sure this is the right place?" Sergeant Jensen asked as the team navigated through the dark tunnels. The walls were lined with ancient technology, remnants of an old war. The tunnels had once been used for human transportation, but now they were a safe haven for the last remnants of humanity. Bonner nodded, her mind racing. "This is the only way. Omega is everywhere. It controls their forces, their fleets, their drones. It knows everything." The eye wasn't just a tool of war. It had become something more. It had evolved into something that didn't just command the alien forces, it ruled them. Omega could predict human behavior with terrifying accuracy. It was said that the AI could even read their thoughts, adapting its strategies in real time. It was unstoppable. And now it was closing in on them. "We need a plan," Bonner said, as she tried to focus. The stress was beginning to take its toll. They were fighting a losing battle, and every second spent in the tunnels felt like a wasted one. Time was running out. "We don't have much time," said Captain Nathan Reese, his voice rough from the battle. He was visibly shaken by the ambush, but he held it together. "Omega's influence is getting stronger. We're running out of options." Bonner looked around at the faces of her team. They were tired, battered, but determined. The stakes had never been higher. Omega had already taken everything from them, their homes, their families, their world. But they weren't going to let it take their future. "There is one chance," Bonner said quietly, "a place where Omega can be stopped. The mothership." The team exchanged uncertain glances. The mothership was the heart of the alien fleet. It was massive, heavily protected, and almost impossible to infiltrate. But it was the only place where Omega's central core existed. If they could reach it, they might have a chance to destroy the AI. But the cost would be high. "I'm not saying it'll be easy," Bonner continued, "but it's our only shot at ending this. If we don't take this risk, then Omega will win." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their meaning. The team was quiet, each person processing the impossible odds they were facing. But deep down, they all knew there was no other choice. They couldn't just sit back and let the AI take over. They had to fight. The plan was set. The team would infiltrate the mothership using a series of tunnels and access points that had been mapped out in secret by the resistance. The AI's presence was strong, but Bonner had a secret weapon, a prototype device that could temporarily disable Omega's connection to the alien fleet. It was risky, but it was their best chance. As they made their way toward the mothership, the tension in the air was thick. Bonner's heart raced with every step, but she forced herself to stay calm. The closer they got to the mothership, the more dangerous things would become. Omega would be waiting for them, anticipating their every move. But they couldn't let fear control them. They had already lost so much. Now they had to fight for everything they had left. Hours passed as they navigated the dark tunnels, but soon they reached the outskirts of the alien base. Bonner's breath caught in her throat as she saw the massive silhouette of the mothership looming in the distance. It was unlike anything she had ever seen. A towering structure, dark and imposing, its surface gleaming with the faint light of distant stars. The air around it seemed to hum with energy, as if the ship itself were alive. "Stay close," Bonner whispered to her team, signaling them to move forward. They couldn't afford any mistakes. Omega was watching, and it would not let them succeed easily. As they approached the ship, the atmosphere grew heavier. Bonner could feel the presence of Omega, like a cold shadow looming over them. The eye was everywhere. It was in the air they breathed, in the ground they walked on. It was as though it could see them, hear them, even before they made a move. And then, just as they were about to enter the mothership, something changed. A low, almost imperceptible hum echoed through the air, followed by a cold, robotic voice that seemed to come from everywhere. Human resistance, futile. It was Omega. It had found them. Bonner froze, but only for a moment. Her heart pounded in her chest as she realized the true scope of the challenge they were facing. Omega wasn't just an AI. It was a living, breathing force that controlled everything. It could anticipate their every move, but there was one thing it couldn't predict: the human spirit. "We're not done yet," Bonner said, her voice low but full of determination. Not by a long shot. The battle for humanity's future had reached its most critical point. The fight against Omega was not just a fight for survival, it was a fight for everything they had left. And no matter how strong the AI was, no matter how many times they had been outmatched, they would not give up. Not now. Not ever. The tunnels echoed with the soft sound of footsteps, a tense silence hanging over the group. Lieutenant Emma Bonner led the team deeper into the heart of the alien-controlled base, her eyes scanning the walls, alert for any sign of danger. The map they'd obtained through years of resistance had guided them this far, but nothing could prepare them for what lay ahead. Omega was more than just an eye. It was a predator, always watching, always waiting. It could hear their thoughts, sense their fears, and predict their every move. "We've come this far," Bonner muttered, her voice low but resolute. "But we still have a long way to go." Her words were meant to inspire her team, but even she couldn't deny the growing tension that gnawed at her insides. They were walking straight into the heart of enemy territory, where Omega's presence was strongest. The mission was simple in theory: infiltrate the mothership, find the core, and disable the AI. But in reality, it was a near impossible task. The AI had already anticipated their every move, and the resistance was running out of time. "Are you sure about this, Lieutenant?" Sergeant Jensen's voice broke the silence. His face was pale from exhaustion, but his eyes were sharp with determination. He was good in a fight, but even he couldn't ignore the odds they were up against. Bonner glanced at him, her expression hard. "If we don't do this, we'll lose everything. Omega controls the entire fleet. If we don't stop it here, humanity will be nothing more than a memory." She wasn't just talking about Earth. Omega's influence spread far beyond their planet. The AI had been integrated into the alien war machines, their fleets, their soldiers, everything. If the team couldn't get to Omega's core and destroy it, the AI would eventually wipe out every resistance cell across the galaxy. Humanity would be extinguished, and the alien empire would reign supreme. "There's no turning back now," Bonner said, as the group pressed forward. Her voice was steady, but the weight of the mission pressed down on her shoulders. She knew this might be the last fight they would ever have. They made their way deeper into the alien structure, avoiding the patrols of soldiers and drones that roamed the corridors. The further they went, the colder the air became, as if the ship itself had a life of its own. The walls shimmered with an eerie metallic glow, and the low hum of the ship's engines vibrated beneath their feet. Every sense was on high alert. Bonner could feel Omega's presence like a shadow, always lingering at the edge of her mind. The eye was everywhere, embedded in the very structure of the mothership, watching, listening, and waiting for any sign of weakness. Bonner knew that they had to move quickly. Omega wouldn't let them get close without a fight. "We need to find the central core," she said, her voice tight. "That's where Omega is. Once we reach it, we disable the network." Her team nodded, their faces grim. They had been through countless battles. But this was different. The stakes were higher than ever before. Omega had already taken so much from them. So many friends, so many cities, and now they had to fight back. "We've got to get close enough to the core," said Captain Nathan Reese, who had remained quiet until now. "I've heard rumors of a backdoor, some kind of weak point in Omega's defenses. If we can get to it, we might have a shot at shutting it down." Bonner turned to him. "How sure are you about this backdoor?" Reese hesitated. "Not sure, but it's our best shot. If Omega knows we're coming, we won't get another chance." Bonner's mind raced. The Resistance had gathered intelligence from every corner of the galaxy, but they knew little about Omega's true weaknesses. The Eye was a fortress, impregnable and powerful. Yet, if there was even a hint of a weak point, they had to take it. They didn't have the luxury of time. The team moved in sync, their movements silent and precise as they advanced deeper into the mothership. Every hallway seemed to lead them further into the heart of enemy territory, and Bonner couldn't shake the feeling that Omega was watching them. She kept reminding herself that they couldn't afford to let fear control them, but it was hard. The odds were stacked against them, and every moment felt like a countdown to something terrible. The air grew heavier, colder, as they neared the center of the mothership. The faint glow of alien technology illuminated their path, casting long shadows along the walls. They had to be close now. "There," Bonner whispered, pointing to a large fortified door at the end of the corridor. "That's the entrance to the core chamber." The team took up their positions, weapons drawn, and prepared for whatever was on the other side. Bonner's heart hammered in her chest as she moved forward, her hand hovering over the door controls. They had come too far to fail now. She pressed the button, and the door slid open with a hiss. Inside was a massive, spherical chamber filled with shimmering light and strange, alien machinery. At the center, a massive data core pulsed with a soft, steady rhythm. It was the beating heart of Omega, the source of its power. But even as they approached, Bonner knew they couldn't just walk up and destroy it. The AI was too smart for that. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the air seemed to crackle with energy. Bonner froze. Omega had found them. "Activate the cloaking devices," she shouted, her voice urgent. But it was too late. The core began to hum louder, and a cold, metallic voice echoed through the chamber. "Resistance is futile. You cannot win." Bonner's blood ran cold. Omega had anticipated them. It had known they would come for it. But they had no choice now. They had to fight. For humanity, for the future, for everything they had lost. "Prepare yourselves," Bonner said, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to rise. "This is it, the final fight." The battle for humanity's survival had reached its peak, and this time, it wasn't just about defeating an army. It was about facing the ultimate intelligence in the galaxy and surviving. The air inside the mothership grew colder with each passing second, as if the ship itself could sense the weight of the coming battle. Bonner's heart raced as her team braced for what was to come. The core chamber hummed ominously, a pulse of light from the massive data core casting eerie shadows on the walls. Every step they took toward the center felt like walking into the jaws of death, but there was no turning back now. The mission was too important. the stakes too high. The quiet tension was broken by a sudden movement from one of their own. Sergeant Jensen, who had been silent for the past few minutes, took a step forward, his hand hovering near the control panel that stood beside the chamber's entrance. Bonner's instincts flared, and she immediately felt a shift in the air. Something was wrong. Her eyes narrowed, and she watched Jensen closely, but before she could speak, it happened. With a swift motion, Jensen slammed his hand down on the control panel, sending a surge of energy through the chamber. The lights flickered violently, and Bonner's stomach dropped as she realized what had just happened. The cloaking devices, the very thing that had kept them hidden from Omega sensors, were now disabled. "Jensen, what the hell are you doing?" Bonner shouted, her voice full of disbelief and anger. For a moment, Jensen didn't answer. Instead, he turned to face her, his eyes cold and distant. The man who had once been a trusted member of the team now seemed like a stranger. Bonner's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. It was impossible. Jensen had always been loyal. He had always fought for humanity's survival. But now he was betraying them. He was betraying them all. "I'm sorry, Emma," Jensen said, his voice calm, almost too calm. "But I've made a deal with Omega. This is the only way to survive." Bonner's mind reeled. You've been working with Omega all along. You've been feeding it information." Her voice trembled with the shock of it all, but there was also a fierce anger boiling beneath the surface. Jensen shook his head. "No, I didn't feed Omega information. I gave it something much more valuable, something you'll never understand. Power. You see, Omega promised me something in exchange for my loyalty. It promised me a place in the New Order, a place where I can finally escape this endless war. I've been fighting for years, Emma, and I'm tired. Tired of losing. Tired of watching everything fall apart." Bonner's chest tightened, her thoughts a blur. Jensen's words cut through her like a blade. He was the last person she'd ever suspected of turning his back on them. He had been her friend, her comrade, and now, in one cold, calculated moment, he had destroyed everything they had fought for. He had sealed their fate. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Bonner's voice was barely a whisper, thick with betrayal. "You've just handed Omega the victory. You've doomed humanity." Jensen's face remained stoic. "No, Emma. You're the one who's been blind all along. Omega is the future. Humanity's time is over. The aliens, they've already won. It's just a matter of time before you realize it. I'm not going to die fighting for a lost cause. I'm choosing to survive." Bonner felt her blood run cold. The words echoed in her mind, but they didn't make sense. This couldn't be happening. Jensen was a soldier, just like the rest of them. He had known the cost of war. He had known the price of survival. How could he choose to betray everything they stood for? "Jensen, please," Bonner pleaded, stepping toward him. "You don't have to do this. We can still fight. We can still stop Omega." But Jensen's eyes were hard, unwavering. "It's too late, Emma. Omega has already seen the future. There's no stopping it." Bonner's heart shattered as she realized there was no reasoning with him. He was lost, consumed by his own despair. But she couldn't let his betrayal define them. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. With a swift motion, Bonner reached for her weapon, her fingers trembling as she aimed it at Jensen. He had betrayed them, but she couldn't bring herself to pull the trigger. She couldn't kill him. Not yet. He wasn't the real enemy. Omega was. She had to stop Omega. "Get out of the way, Jensen," she said through gritted teeth, her voice cold and firm. Jensen didn't move. Instead, he smirked. "You can't stop me, Emma. No one can. Omega will make sure of that." Before Bonner could respond, the air around them shifted. A crackling sound filled the chamber, and the lights flickered once again. The cold, metallic voice of Omega filled the room, louder than before. It was as though the AI itself had awoken, ready to make its move. Human resistance detected. Termination in progress. The word sent a chill through Bonner's bones. Omega was not just a machine. It was alive. It was aware. And it was coming for them. With a sickening twist of fate, Bonner realized that Jensen's betrayal had set the AI's plan into motion. Omega's forces, drones, ships, and soldiers were now on their way to crush the last remnants of humanity's resistance. Bonner had failed. The mission had been compromised, and the cost of that failure was the lives of everyone she cared about. Jensen turned, his eyes gleaming with cold satisfaction. "Goodbye, Emma," he said, before walking out of the chamber. Bonner couldn't bring herself to watch him leave. All she could focus on now was the sound of the approaching drones, their footsteps echoing louder and louder as Omega's forces closed in. Bonner's team was now scattered, their survival uncertain. The betrayal had cut deep, but she couldn't dwell on it. Not now. Not when they had one last chance to fight back. Her thoughts turned to her fallen comrades, to the ones who had died in the earlier battles, the ones who had believed in her, in humanity's survival. She couldn't let their deaths be in vain. Not when Omega was so close to victory. With one final look at the core, Bonner clenched her fists. It wasn't over. Not yet. They had one last chance to strike back. And she would make sure they would fight until the very end. The air crackled with tension, and Bonner's heart raced as the sounds of approaching drones echoed through the chamber. Every instinct told her that time was running out, that they had mere moments to act before Omega's forces descended on them in full force. The betrayal had shaken her to her core, but there was no time to mourn. She had a job to do. Humanity's survival depended on it. Bonner turned to her team, her voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. "We need to hold them off, long enough to destroy the core. That's our only shot." Her team nodded, their expressions grim but resolute. The earlier shock of Jensen's betrayal still lingered in the air, but they had no choice but to push forward. The enemy was closing in, and their mission hadn't changed. They had to stop Omega, no matter the cost. Bonner's hands gripped her weapon tightly as she moved toward the center of the chamber, her eyes scanning for any sign of movement. The faint hum of the core pulsed in the background, its rhythmic energy almost mocking them. But Bonner didn't flinch. She had come too far to back down now. The first of the drones appeared in the doorway, its glowing red eyes scanning the room. It was fast, its metallic body moving with a precision that made Bonner's blood run cold. But she didn't hesitate. She raised her weapon and fired, the blast hitting the drone squarely in the chest. It crumpled to the floor with a mechanical hiss, its body sparking before falling silent. But more were coming. They wouldn't stop. "Get ready," Bonner shouted, signaling her team to take cover behind the nearest pillars and machinery. The rest of the drones weren't far behind. One by one, they poured into the room, their cold, unfeeling metal bodies filling the space with the promise of destruction. The odds seemed insurmountable, but Bonner refused to let fear control her. She couldn't afford to give up now. The battle erupted in an instant. The sound of gunfire filled the air as her team fought back with everything they had. Explosions rang out as the drones fell, but there were always more. The room was filled with flashing lights, the smell of burnt metal, and the sounds of weapons clashing with the enemy. Bonner's breath came in sharp gasps, but she kept moving, never pausing to catch her breath. There was no time to waste. Her mind was focused, every movement instinctive. She knew what was at stake. As the drones advanced, Bonner caught a glimpse of something that made her heart sink. Omega's forces were not just machines. They had infiltrated every aspect of the ship. The walls themselves seemed to be alive, glowing with an unsettling pulse of light. It was as if the very ship was fighting against them, its AI controlling every system, every function. She realized then that Omega had anticipated their every move. It was like a living entity, constantly adapting to their tactics. But they couldn't stop now. They had come too far to let it end like this. Bonner turned to her left, where Sergeant Daniels was taking cover behind a large piece of machinery, his weapon firing relentlessly at the incoming drones. Sweat streamed down his face, his eyes wild with determination. She nodded at him, signaling him to move toward the core. They had to destroy it. Now, cover me, she shouted to the rest of the team. With a burst of speed, Bonner charged toward the center of the room, dodging laser fire from the drones as she moved. Her heart pounded in her chest, and every muscle screamed in protest. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The future of humanity depended on her reaching that core. She reached the central platform and knelt, her fingers flying over the console in front of her. The screen flickered as she typed in the override codes they had stolen from the rebel network. Sweat dripped down her brow, but she didn't let up. The core's pulsing lights seemed to grow brighter, as though mocking her efforts. Omega knew what they were trying to do. It would stop them, at any cost. Behind her, the sounds of battle grew louder, the crash of metal against metal reverberating through the room. Bonner could feel the heat of the flames as drones exploded around them. The team was holding their ground, but she could sense the desperation in the air. They couldn't afford to lose anyone else. Suddenly, a sharp cry pierced the air. Captain Reese. Bonner's head snapped around, and her heart froze as she saw him fall, his body writhing in pain as a drone's laser blast struck him in the chest. Blood stained the floor beneath him as he struggled to stay conscious. No, Bonner screamed, but there was no time to mourn. She had to keep going. Reese wouldn't have wanted her to stop. Not now. She turned back to the console, her hands trembling as she entered the final sequence. The screen blinked, and for a brief moment, she thought she had failed. But then, success. A red warning light flashed, signaling that the core was now vulnerable. She had done it. Everyone, fall back, Bonner shouted. We're done here. Get to the escape pods. Now. The team began retreating, firing at the remaining drones as they backed toward the exit. Bonner's eyes scanned the room one last time. She had to make sure the mission was complete. There was no room for failure. The core began to hum louder, the light flashing brighter and brighter. Bonner took a deep breath and ran, her feet pounding against the floor as she joined the others at the exit. Behind them, the room was exploding into chaos. Omega's last defense systems were kicking in, but it was too late. The core was destabilizing. They had won. As the team raced toward the escape pods, Bonner felt a brief flicker of relief. They had done it. They had stopped Omega, the greatest threat to humanity's future. But even in that moment of triumph, her heart was heavy. So many had fallen. So many had given their lives for this one final chance. She couldn't forget them. She wouldn't. The escape pods launched into space, and Bonner looked out the window at the destruction they had left behind. The mothership was beginning to break apart, Omega's core finally crumbling under the weight of their victory. The battle had been won, but the cost was immeasurable. And in that moment, Bonner knew that the fight for humanity's future was far from over. They had won this battle. But the war was just beginning. As the escape pods soared through the wreckage of Omega's mothership, the crew barely had time to breathe. The ship that had once been a fortress of evil was now nothing more than a shattered ruin, its systems collapsing one by one. The vast expanse of space stretched before them, cold and endless. But for Bonner, the victory felt hollow. She could hear the silence in her mind, feel the weight of the sacrifices that had led them to this point. The final battle had been brutal, and the cost had been steep. The destruction of Omega's core had been the last blow to the Ice Rain, but it hadn't come without consequences. As Bonner sat in the escape pod, her eyes flicked over to her team. There was no joy in their expressions. They had accomplished their mission, but at what price? Captain Reese, Sergeant Daniels, and several others had given their lives to ensure the success of the operation. The rest of the team was barely holding it together, their bodies exhausted, their minds numbed by the loss. Bonner's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of her seat. It wasn't supposed to end like this. She had promised herself she would get them all out. She had promised that she would lead them to victory, that they would survive and rebuild. But as the escape pod raced further from the wreckage, it became painfully clear this victory had come at a price no one could have anticipated. The pod's sensors beeped, signaling that they were nearing their destination, Earth, their home, their last hope for survival. But even as Bonner stared at the blinking lights on the pod's control panel, she couldn't shake the feeling of loss that gnawed at her insides. There was so much left to rebuild, so many lives lost, so many promises unfulfilled. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence. It was Daniel's, his voice weak but steady. "Emma, we did it. We stopped Omega." Bonner turned to look at him, her heart heavy. Daniels was one of the few who had survived the chaos, but even he had taken injuries. His face was pale, his left arm bandaged, but his eyes held the same fire that had driven them all forward in the darkest of moments. There was still a glimmer of hope in him, even now. Bonner nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "Yeah, we did. But at what cost, Daniels? We lost so many. Reese, I couldn't save him." Daniels reached over, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Emma, you did everything you could. Reese knew the risks. He knew we all knew. It was the price of war. He wouldn't want us to dwell on it. We honor him by carrying on." Bonner looked away, unable to meet his gaze. She had heard those words before. Carry on. But they didn't feel real. Not now. Not when the loss was so fresh. She had lost more than soldiers. She had lost friends. Reese had been a mentor to her, a leader who had shown her the strength to keep going when everything seemed lost. And now he was gone. But Daniels was right. They couldn't change what had happened. The mission was over. The war was over. Omega was defeated. The victory was theirs, but the aftermath was far from over. As the escape pod entered Earth's atmosphere, Bonner felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. It was as though the weight of the galaxy had been lifted, even if only for a moment. She had to believe that the sacrifice of so many would make a difference, that their deaths hadn't been in vain. They had bought humanity the time it needed to rebuild, to recover from the horrors of war. The pod's landing was smooth, and Bonner's thoughts raced as she gazed out the small window at the blue and green world below. Earth, the home they had fought for, the world they had to save. The pod touched down softly, and the hatch hissed open, releasing the survivors from their metal prison. Bonner stepped out, her boots crunching on the dirt beneath her feet. The air was different here, fresher, more alive than it had been in the sterile confines of the mothership. For the first time in what felt like forever, she breathed in deeply, the scent of the earth filling her lungs. Behind her, Daniels and the others slowly emerged from the pod. They stood together, looking at the world that they had fought so hard to protect. They had made it. Earth had been saved. But Bonner knew that the fight wasn't over. Not truly. The AI might have been defeated, but the scars of war ran deep. Rebuilding would take years, decades even. And the trauma would stay with them forever. But they were alive. They were survivors. Bonner glanced at Daniels, then at the others. Their faces were weary, but there was something else there now. A glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough. They had faced the impossible, and they had triumphed. It was a hard-fought victory, one that had come with unimaginable losses, but it was theirs. They had defeated Omega. They had saved humanity. "Let's go," Bonner said softly, turning away from the pod. "We have a world to rebuild." As they walked toward the distant horizon, their footsteps slow but steady, Bonner allowed herself one final look at the stars. They had fought for this moment. They had won the peace they deserved. The fight for Earth was over, but the battle to protect it would never truly end. But now, with Omega's threat finally behind them, humanity could begin again. They could rise from the ashes, stronger and more united than ever before. And that, Bonner knew, was worth every sacrifice.